why not strike exactly at capital's fear by mapping the abundance that it fears? In Hawaii, where cartographies of capital depict abundant lands as wastelands, they're actually very abundant lands, but in order to condemn the lands for industrial projects, the state will say, oh, these lands are agriculturally unfeasible. They're not being used to their best and highest use. Therefore, we should build a light industrial complex here. Mapping is not just a depiction of wastelands. It's actually integral to the creation of wasteland.
Hey, I am Michael Yadrick. I am an ecological restoration practitioner living on Puyallup territory, now known as the Grit City, Tacoma, Washington. This is Tree Hugger Podcast, where we discuss mapping abundance, cultural survivance, and the cascading effects of local restoration. In this conversation you are about to hear, Candace Fujikane leads us through Kanaka Maoli, the traditional name of the Hawaiian people, Cartographies, to map the connections of abundance in the ecosystem. Candace is a professor of English at the University of Hawaiʻi. The good people at Duke University Press sent me her newest book, Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, Kanaka Maoli and Critical Settler Cartographies in Hawaii. The book was the reason I reached out to her, and restoration plays a key role in the historic and present-day stories she tells. Professor Fujikane is truly a multidimensional human being, actively engaging indigenous cartography in the art of kilo, whereby observing laws of the natural order is based on long-time observation and recording in story and song relationships with the almost 500,000 akua. The akua are the elemental forms who guide the people in their daily lives and embody the lands, seas, and skies. Professor Fujikane's writing and research both challenges the perverse logic and operations of the U.S. occupying settler state and foregrounds the future imaginary beyond it. She is involved in land struggles against toxic waste dumping, leaking military jet fuel tanks, and astronomical industrial telescope complexes in sacred and celebrated spaces such as Lualua Valley, the birthplace of Maui and the largest coastal valley on the leeward side of Oahu, as well as Mauna Wākea, the highest place on the island of Hawaii and the second highest peak of an island on Earth. As a settler ally, Professor Fujikane articulates indigenous ancestral knowledge into a unique cartography unlike the dominant map-making paradigm via moʻolelo, which are historic stories, oli, which are chants, and mele, songs. Though she doesn't flaunt it, she also combines good old research into the bureaucracy. She digs into state-registered maps and aerial images that marks areas that were formerly in taro. The maps also become designs for the future restoration because they map the old moʻoaina along the waterways, the smaller land divisions that are part of a larger land base, genealogically connected to one another and the flow of water from mountain to ocean. Candace asserts abundant-mindedness is a radical refusal of capitalist economies of scarcity. Abundance is expressed out of Kanaka Maoli restoration projects, as practitioners assert their capacity to determine their own decolonial futures. Indigenous peoples are not waiting for the dismantling of occupying or settler states or the return of their ancestral lands, but are actively living that independent future in the present. They live ia now, a word that describes emergence, sovereignty, air, or breath, like volcanic islands developing from the depths of the ocean, in non-status ways that include the restoration of taro pond fields, fish ponds, irrigation waterways, and ancestral knowledge. Elevating abundance pays off. For example, restoration of streams provides cool water, which helps create conditions for the regeneration of coral in a time of increasing acidification and temperature of the oceans. I think these examples of very local efforts in Hawaii demonstrate how complex patterns and cascading effects emerge out of a variety of local restorative actions. I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with Professor Candace Fujikane, and I'm glad to bring you this episode on mapping abundance. It starts right here. Enjoy the conversation. Thanks for being on the podcast. Can you tell us about yourself and what led you to write this book at this time?
So my name's Candace Fujikane, and I grew up on Maui. I went to the University of Hawaiʻi, and then I went to UC Berkeley for my PhD. And I'm fourth generation Japanese, so I'm not Hawaiian. but I have taken Hawaiian language for 6 years, and I've been part of the Hawaiian movement for independence and sovereignty for the last 25 years or so. I've been teaching at the University of Hawaiʻi for 25 years. And I was actually very fortunate to be good friends with Haunani K. Trask, who is a very prominent sovereignty leader, and I learned so much from her. And I actually edited a book before this one called Asian Settler Colonialism in Hawaii, where I talk about what it means to be an Asian settler in Hawaii. And you can imagine that when the book came out, it was very controversial. A lot of Asians in Hawaii don't like being called settlers. They think that only white people are settlers. And according to Haunani, no. Anyone who is not a Hawaiian, who is not Pacific Islander, who's not Black, is a settler. So she had a different terminology for Blacks. She said, she was heavily influenced by Malcolm X and Angela Davis and the Black Panthers. And so she said that Blacks are not settlers, but Asians are. So my job as an Asian settler was really to try to educate and to raise questions for Asian communities, because Asians dominate the state legislature and they make up about 65% of the legislature. 40% of the state legislature is Japanese, like me, even though we are only 20% of the general population. So Japanese have a tremendous amount of political control in Hawaii. So that was my first book. And this book is kind of a follow-up to that book. So in that book, Haunani said it was important for us to point to the problems that Asians pose in Hawaii in terms of blocking Hawaiian movements for sovereignty or independence. And I asked her at the time, can I talk about the settlers who are allies? And she said, no, not yet. Too soon. She said if we did that, everyone would rush to identify as a settler ally, and we needed to make people sit with the discomfort of being named a settler. And so more recently, this book was a way for me to talk about how we can move from being settlers to being settler allies, and even more specifically to being settler aloha aina. So settler aloha aina are those who support Hawaiian independence, but also support or stand for the protection of lands and waters. And that's actually probably why this book makes sense for this podcast, because through the work of writing this book, I did come to find how much I love trees.
Everyone does.
Right?
Yeah. At some
Right.
point in time, there's a realization that trees are wonderful. That's great. Well, yeah, sitting with the discomfort is such a good perspective and a good thing to sit with. I recently introduced myself for the first time as a settler just recently. And I think saying it out loud is real different than like reading about it. Even it was in a group or virtual room with Indigenous women, and they were claiming their heritage and where they were from. And yeah, I felt like it was the time. And that was my turn to introduce myself. Everyone sort of knew each other, but it was my turn, and that's what I said. It was kind of powerful. I think it takes some getting used to.
I think land acknowledgements now are just part of the way we do our presentations. We say, I'll say I'm speaking from Kanaka Maoli lands in He'eauli, which is where I live. And I guess what my book is getting at is how can we go beyond land acknowledgements to doing the physical work of standing for lands and waters. And that's been a part of my journey that's been both difficult and yet has taught me so much. I've been arrested for standing for lands. I've stood on the front lines against police with tear gas and sound cannons, and all of that has been so worth it in terms of learning from people their stories about their connectedness to land. We say how they're pili to the aina, how they're connected to the land. Yeah. And that's also enlarged my worldview.
Great. I mean, I love that you're a scholar, but also you're standing on the front lines. I noticed that one before I reached out to you. I did a little research on you. I was like, yeah, she's She's got street credibility.
Yeah, and a lot of my book, I'm really grateful because a lot of people were willing to share their stories with me, and I was able to quote, their voices so that their voices could reverberate throughout the book. So it wasn't just me talking about land struggle. Most of them don't have access to publication, and so it was a chance for them to tell their stories, and I sent copies of the book to them so that they would always have that for their children.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so speaking of the book, I mean, the first thing that really struck me before I even had it in my hand, and the reason why I wanted access to it was I was struck by the artwork on the cover and within the book, as well as your use of native Hawaiian language. So I was curious how you chose to use the art in multiple language to aid in telling the story you wanted to tell.
I'm so glad you asked that question because the book cover was really what helped me to define what the book would be about. So the art is by a Hawaiian artist. Her name is Meala Aloha Bishop, and I call her Meala. And she is just this amazingly gifted artist. She really is a kind of impressionistic artist. Like if you see her landscapes, they're just incredibly beautiful. And she has these signature brushstrokes. So she'll use different strokes for different elements, like different strokes for water or different strokes for mud or different strokes for water as it's flowing. And her art moves, it just seems to be moving in place. And she one time she told me that she knows a piece of art is done when she looks at it and it just shimmers. And so she talks about her philosophy behind her brushstrokes, and she says that for Kanaka Maoli, so many of their daily practices, like beating kapa, planting kalo, weaving lauhala, or any of the woodworking that they do, all has to do with rhythms and patterns. And so she tries to incorporate the rhythms of practices into her artwork. So the piece that was done, it's called Kalopa'a o Waiahole, and it's about the hard taro of Waiahole. But that phrase, Kalopa'a o Waiahole, is also used in reference to the people of Waiahole. They are the obstinate, they are the persistent, defiant people of Waiahole. And so when developers came into their valley to develop lands and to also divert waters away from their valley, they stood in the courts against the developers, and they won the battle for land. The state actually purchased all of the land and let them farm there. In the terms of water, it was an ongoing battle with the plantations, the sugar plantations, who were diverting waters under the mountain to feed the thirsty sugarcane plantations. They won that battle. They won half of the water back. So in the corm, or the taro, you see all these superimposed images of the people rising up in struggle. And in the leaves of the kalo, that's these brilliant, beautiful leaves of the cover, you see the names and the maps of the ahupua'a. And she says this is important because people in Hawaii no longer know the names of their ahupua'a. So it's a gorgeous, gorgeous cover. And she says that when she was growing up, she thought she lived in Kahalu'u. But when the Hawaiian Civic Club in Ko'olaupoko started actually putting up out of their own pockets, they bought these signs marking all of the ahupua'a, which are the land divisions. She realized she lived in Kalaea. Now that is a significant thing because she thought the stories of Kahalu'u were hers, but she realized there's a whole other subset of stories about the land, about Kalaea. And when you can learn about the names of the winds and the rains and how the kupuna, or the elders, would map, I guess environmentalists call it the resources of the valley, but I don't like the word resources because they're often commodified. I prefer the word the natural elements of the valley. So the winds, the rains, the waters. They knew how water traveled in the valley. Each ahupua has a different set of principles, right? Because water and wind and rain moves differently in each valley. So recovering the name Kalaea was a way for her to really connect back to her ancestral lands. And it's all because of mapping. The mapping, returning to the Kanaka Maoli maps that map the land not according to tax map keys or at latitudes and longitudes, but according to the land divisions called ahupua, which generally stretch from the mountains to the sea, and they're a unit of land division that enables the collection of foods from different realms. So foods from the upland, foods from the lowlands, and food from the ocean. So anyway, I just was so grateful when she said yes. And then her family, the Bishop family, became an integral part of the book because they're kalo farmers and they're fishermen. So they have we have two sons who farm kalo, and they have one son who works at the fish pond. And that's how I was really learning about the importance of the continuity of water flows from the mountains to the sea. It's the mixing of the fresh and the salt waters at the estuaries that enable seaweed to grow, the corals to flourish, and also for the baby fish to feed on all of the goodies that come down from the stream. Yeah. So yeah, I just love the cover, and I was so happy when Duke University Press allowed me to use that painting for the cover.
Yeah, shout out to Duke University Press. They
Yeah.
provided a few books to me and just great works.
Amazing work. Yeah, on water and oceans and yeah.
I mean, it's really beautiful to have translations, like there's English, but then also the Kanaka Maoli language, and in some cases I don't want to say it hurt my brain, it made me work, right? You know that
Yes.
feeling when you're like going back and forth between languages, or
Yeah.
hearing something that your brain can't really like compute, you just sort of like, it's like power down, or I don't know, it's
Yeah.
like trying to power up. And now I feel like some of these words may stick with me, like moʻolelo,
Mhm.
right? Because I feel like that's kind of what we're doing here on the podcast.
Yeah.
It's a great term. And it's not native to where I am, but there's a lot of continuity in those terms, and almost like you're instructing people on, the spirit of the story it comes out in using that other language.
Yeah. Yes, I was really determined to get the Olelo Hawaii in there because there are enough young people and readers now who can read Olelo Hawaii. And so when you provide a translation, they will always wonder, what was the word here? And how come you translated it this way? So I put the languages side by side so that they could see what the original text was in the Nupipa, and the new paper has no diacritical marks, which is challenging. It's very difficult to read because you can read even just the letter I when it's standing alone in a dozen different ways. And so it was for them that I thought, okay, we need to do this. And I'm not the best translator, so I asked my kumu, Kaliko Baker, to do my Olelo Hawaii editing, and he's just wonderful. And just to give you an idea of how the translation process work, I translate something as serves you right. And then he'd come in and he'd go like, nah, 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 nah. This is more like bite me. And so I'd have to go in and edit it out, and I put in bite me, and then in a footnote I would say, my kumu explained that certain words in the text were referring to penises, that they have a double meaning and there was a word play going on.
All right. The
So
footnotes are the best place to
yeah, right.
like explain, like have
Right.
the caveats and the
Exactly.
sub story,
Yeah, it
play
was the
out.
word akola, akola and hail. And so I actually explained it, and he was really happy that he got a space in the footnote to really get at the deeper meaning of what was being said. And bite me has a different connotation than serves you right. So I love that that he helped me that way. And that's why I asked him to help me, because he has that kind of contextual understanding of language, and he knows the mo'olelo and he knows the context. So
Who
I
knew that?
learned.
Who knew that? Like bite me had ancient origins.
I guess, it's kind of a
Who-
universal
yeah.
thing. Right, right.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks for telling me about that. So, in the introduction of the book, you quote David Lloyd, I believe, saying that abundance is the end of capital.
Yeah.
So, later in the chapter, you state, we can see that climate change is bringing about the demise of capital. Can you talk a little bit more about the link between abundance and climate disruption?
Yes. So, yeah, what he said in that talk that really sparked the title for the book is he said, capital fears abundance. And I was like, oh, so capital actually fears something. And why not strike exactly at capital's fear by mapping the abundance that it fears? So that's where the title Mapping Abundance comes from. And it is important because capital is driving climate change. I mean, I think about Naomi Klein's title, Climate or versus Capital, right? And thinking about in Hawaii, where cartographies of capital depict abundant lands as wastelands. They're actually very abundant lands, but in order to condemn the lands for industrial projects, the state will say, oh, these lands are agriculturally unfeasible. They're not being used to their best and highest use. Therefore, we should build a light industrial complex here. And so that's the connection for me that what is like mapping is not just a depiction of wastelands. It's actually integral to the creation of wastelands. It's integral to the process of, Tracy Voiles calls this the wastelanding of the earth. Yeah. So when we look at the stories that Capital tells, like Mauna Wākea, which is the site of a huge struggle right now between Kanaka Maoli and the state claims that Mauna Wākea is a wasteland because they want to condemn that land in order to build astronomical complexes like the 30-meter telescope. But what Kanaka Maoli explain is that that mountain is actually a collector of water. That the primary source of water on Mauna Wākea is actually fog drip, and that the mountain collects the fog drip and the rains and the snows, and it feeds the aquifers. It actually feeds 5 aquifers on the island of Hawaii, and it sits primarily on one aquifer that feeds the island. But the state is intent on depicting Mauna Kea as a barren wasteland, devoid of vegetation and alpine desert. The state never addresses the fact that if you scratch just the dirt, just the surface of the dirt, you can see like in the desert, the the land is actually saturated with water. And anyway, it's just kind of a way of thinking about how corporate capital and the military oftentimes depicts the most abundant lands as wastelands so that they can forward their own project. And on many of the islands, the most abundant lands are actually lands that military bases are now sited on. So I remember one of the planners for Oahu telling me, asking me, do you know what is the most abundant land on Oahu? And I said, no, where? I figure it's on the North Shore, someplace where there's a lot of rain. He says, no, it's actually where Schofield Barracks sits, where they do live fire training. So where at one time Kanaka Maoli would plant for abundance, the military is now planting these seeds of unexploded ordnance. So the land, there's a lot of subsurface unexploded ordnance on Schofield Barracks. So it it'll be very difficult to reclaim that land. And I wouldn't say impossible because there are efforts to regreen the island of Kaho'olawe, which was used for bombing practice for what is it, like 50 years of bombing practice. And the U.S. Federal government appropriated $400 million for the cleanup of Kaho'olawe. And after they used up all the money, there was still unexploded ordnance. But people still view Kaʻolave as a sacred site, and they go there and they're planting trees to help stop the erosion caused by the bombing. And it was an incredibly huge bomb that broke the water table on the island. So they're trying to find ways to plant trees that will attract the rains. Right now, I think a lot of the things they're planting are small shrubs to prevent erosion, but I think the goal will be to plant the trees because there is a saying in Olelo, Hawaii. It was hahai kaua noka ulula, or something. The rains follow the trees. And so they have that knowledge. That's a proverb. There's actually a video online talking about how the rains follow the forests, and that's so important in Hawaii.
That is right. Yeah, and I think the interaction between the land and the waters, and like you were mentioning the nearshore, like the health of the seaweeds and the kelps, really rely on that cool, fresh water, the interface with the salt water and the deeper waters.
Yeah.
Something I'm still learning about and can't fully grasp, especially if you're not a water person. Like a lot of things are they're underneath the surface, especially things that are underground too. We really take them for granted, right? Because we can't see them. We can't see maybe we don't have a relationship with them because they're not visible to us.
Yeah, it is amazing. And there is a foundation in Hawaii called the Edith Kanaka Maoli Foundation on Hawaii Island, where they have a school of knowledge called Papaku Makavalu. And that school has identified 22 vau, or horizontal realms of stewardship. So there are so many, there are 5 realms of the heavens, and another, number of realms for the lands, and another number of lands for the oceans. And so that shows how interconnected these vau are. So there are certain, there are 400,000 gods in Kanaka Maoli worldviews, and these gods, that's been the word akua has been translated as God, but Pualani Hele explains that a more precise translation would be elemental forms. So that Kanaloa is not like a human figure like God of the sea, but he is the sea. He is the deep consciousness of the ocean. And Kane is the consciousness of the waters that travel underground. And they look at all these names of the deities, and they identify Kane Milohai as the lava that travels underground and creates these underground caverns for water to pass from the lands to the oceans. And just it's so beautiful how they translate the names of all of these deities. And I think that shows that their intergenerational art of kilo, or the keen observation of elemental forms, has enabled them to track the relationships between elements. One of the Kanaka Maoli scientists explains that we need to learn the names of all of the in the places where we live. If there are 400,000, we have to identify who are those 400,000 akua, and what are the elemental forms and natural processes they represent. And so Kane is the underground flow of fresh water. There are a lot of springs, ocean springs in the ocean in Hawaii. In the old days, people would actually travel with gourds, and if they couldn't find water on the land, they would go into the ocean, find the freshwater springs that were spouting up, little bubbling up in the ocean, and they would collect fresh water in the ocean, which is so amazing, right? Now, the relationship between Kane and Kanaloa is that Kane's cool waters makes sure that the waters around the islands are cold. And so when the hurricanes come barreling over Kanaloa and they come towards Hawaii, they either veer north or they veer south because of these cold water flows. And so that is the relationship between the water on the land and the water in the ocean, that they have those kind of elemental dynamics that actually have protected Kanaka Maoli for centuries, and they've
Yeah.
observed those relationships.
Yeah, so I can see where the water is disrupted from the mountaintop down to the shore. And then you also have these hurricanes, which are normal, right? And
Or they're increasing.
so you're
Yeah,
basically more vulnerable to them
yeah,
because of the settler cartographies that you talk about in the book, right? That have divided up the land into these squares and rectangles and whatnot, and disrupted what we generally call watersheds. I
yes,
don't know if that
yes,
term,
yes,
yeah, we talk about watersheds. I
yes,
don't know if that's a ubiquitous term or whatnot, but
yes,
yeah,
yes,
I'm
it
thinking
is.
of similarities, and other listeners could think about places and where they live too, where yeah, water is life, and it just and in the Pacific Northwest where I live, I mean, it's like we're kind of in a rainy
Yeah,
place, and we're in that transition right now in May where, we're leaning towards drought, and that's fairly normal as well. But with climate disruption, our droughts are extended. They're
yes,
longer. We get the same amount of rain, but in a shorter amount of time during the winter. And
yes.
so that's how our hydrologic cycle has been disrupted for sure.
For us as well, we have the same problems with the drier weather and the cloud forests being pushed higher up to the mountain tops. So 90% of the forests in Hawaii, on the dryland forests, are actually now made up of invasive species. So it's 90%. And they are made up of particularly albizia. Albizia is the worst tree for us because it grows much faster than native trees. It drinks 3 times the water of native trees, and it has thousands of seeds. And so it spreads really quickly. And so the point is to try to reforest native trees has been a really important part of water conservation efforts in Hawaii, thinking about the watersheds as well. But also, what I think is important is you had a really great podcast on weeds. And we
Mm-hmm.
do have a group called Ho'oluaina where they actually repurpose the invasive albizia to make canoes. So they've tried to
Oh, yeah,
find a
yeah.
use for, they actually say there, it's really beautiful. They say there's no such thing as a weed. There are only plants for whom we don't know its purpose yet.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
I love that line.
yeah,
That's so great. I know.
yeah.
And I think since hanging out with this group, Just Language group, yeah, I'm starting to think about other, yeah, uses or other gifts that these weeds or these plants give us. Actually, going back towards at the very beginning of the podcast, an episode with Julia Plevin about forest bathing, and she pointedly said something to me at the end of that episode
Oh,
about, I think, just relaxing and just like not worrying about the weeds so much, or just thinking about the gifts that the weeds present. But again, like your albizia, there's like probably something similar here that
yeah.
we haven't figured out what much use, for
Purpose,
some of
yeah.
these plants. But we know things are edible. We can create, they could be used for fiber, for weaving. We could probably eat them, without being harmed. There are some that actually can cause issues, skin issues if we rub up against them. Those are the ones we really detest.
Oh, right, right,
Yeah.
right. Oh,
So,
no,
but,
yeah, I know. That's terrible. Like the poison ivy is
mhm,
awful. But the albizas, we do have to still take them out because
mhm,
that's the problem, is because they drink 3 times the water of native trees. That's what's causing our watershed to suffer. And
mhm,
our water tables have dropped like 14 feet or something crazy
yeah,
like that. We are facing a water crisis in Hawaii. People don't think of Hawaii as a place for water crisis, but there's constant development. They want to bring in 15,000 new homes in this new Ho'opili development project. 15,000 homes, and we don't even have enough water for the current population. So they're talking about desalination plants, which are awful because
mhm,
I know that in other places they've kind of figured out a way to repurpose the salt, but in general, you don't want to mess with, it's just kind of crazy when you do that kind of, what is going to be the ecological effects, right?
It's really energy intensive as well.
Exactly,
It's like, might as well
that
just
too.
preserve what you got.
Exactly.
Right? So,
Right.
just like last week, or depending on when people listen to this, a few weeks back, Hawaii became the first state to declare a climate emergency. Do you think, does that mean anything?
I think that's a really important step for the state to recognize that as an issue, because the state tends to look at things from the side of the profit motive, right? And I think what's really getting them is this question of what will happen to the hotels in Waikiki when sea level rise inundates Waikiki, right? They see tourism as the primary driver of the economy in Hawaii. I think that is in part the reason why such an emergency could be declared in Hawaii. But I'm hoping that this will pave the way for, or I hate the word pave the way. Maybe this will make space for, climate change projects that will help to mitigate or turn the tide of climate change. Things like, just reforestry, taking a look at how the military uses water. Right now, they're allowed to use whatever waters they want under the name of national security. Also, regulation of the corporate diversion of water. I think those kinds of things, if you think about climate change emergencies, that would be important. Look at conservation efforts. The state has right now a very problematic environmental precedent. When they ruled in the Mauna Kea case to permit the building of the TMT, the reasoning was that because what it's now kind of called the degradation principle, because the Mauna is so degraded by the existing 13 telescopes, that the construction of the TMT would not would not tip the balance from a less than significant impact to a significant impact, because significant impact has already been arrived at. Now that makes no sense, because it undermines any logic, any kind of reasoning for rejecting applications for permits. So what one of the this was the logic that was passed at the Supreme Court. One of the Supreme Court justices, though, reminded everyone that the purpose of environmental law is to protect what's damaged and to repair what's left. That should be the state's motto, and I'm hoping that a climate emergency will kind of push that kind of reasoning instead of the degradation principle. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful, but there's a part of me that will always be sort of cynical about the state because it's driven by capital. And that's why in the book I suggest that Kanaka Maoli are working toward a future beyond the state, beyond the settler state, a future that can either be statist or non-statist. It doesn't have to be like a state in order to function. Non-statist forms of organizing would be we saw happening on Mauna Kea in 2019, when the people were feeding themselves. They were providing for medical needs for people who were there on the Mauna, which actually takes a huge toll on your body physically because you're at the 6,000 foot elevation level. The Mauna is actually 13,000 feet tall, and we were at the base of the mountain. So, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that there can be a future beyond the settler state, one where we place the laws of the elements at the foreground, where laws of the elements supersede the laws of humans. And those laws have been determined by Kanaka Maoli through their practices of kilo. And one critical one we've talked about so far is the law that dictates the free flow of water from the mountains to the seas. That is one of the elemental laws that they've determined from observation.
And I'd like you to, if you could talk about that, what informs that switch to seeing abundance versus perceiving scarcity in the world.
Yeah. So I asked Puni Jackson, who manages the Ho'olu'aina restoration project, and I asked her, "Are you concerned about climate change, or what are you guys doing to approach climate change. And she was just exasperated with the question, because she said, everybody keeps asking me that. And as Indigenous people, we've dealt with waves and waves and waves of colonialism and these kinds of environmental catastrophes. We've learned to adjust and to think long term, intergenerationally. And I think that's been so important. She says, I want to focus on abundant mindedness rather than thinking of Hawaiians as always being less than or not having enough or all this was taken away from us. Instead of that kind of deficit thinking, let's focus on an abundant mindedness that look at what is left to us. What are the gifts that we continue to enjoy today? Our babies, our families, the teachings of our elders, our kupuna, those are all gifts that we need to honor today. And I thought that that was so powerful to think about that kind of abundant mindedness, and that it's not the end of the world, but as one Kanaka Maoli scientist said, it's the end of Western civilization. It's the end of capital. It's a way of rethinking how would we live in a world beyond capital. And I thought that that was more productive, looking to moon phases and trying to figure out, okay, so if you have less water, how can you make the most of the water that you do have based on reading, the predictions of moon phases? Or, that's what the kalo farmers are doing. They're adapting to what they see. They're using that puna or ancestral knowledge to take advantage of even that language, see, take advantage of, I got to change my language, but to make the most of what they have. And I've also asked the fish pond operator, they're called mahi fish farmers. And, we tend to think of fish farming as a really negative thing, but for them, they're talking about traditional cultivation of fish. And I asked them, what will you do when sea level rises? And they said, we will adapt by reverting to freshwater fish ponds that our ancestors also used. So they're already planning ahead, to make the most of what's available.
Yeah, they have their eyes on the prize.
Yeah.
It actually is a segue into this question I have too about what your favorite tree is.
So I love hau. And it has a huge story behind it. And I was really looking forward to this question because I never thought about it. What is my favorite tree? But it is the hau. And the hau the technical name is Hibiscus tiliaceus. It is the bodily form of Haumea, who is the deity of birthing and rebirth, regeneration. And Haumea she's just the embodiment of potentiality. One of her kinolau is Papahanao Moku, Earth Mother, or she who is the foundation who births islands. And so Haumea takes the form of the hau, and the hau is also beloved by the mo'o, and the mo'o are the 30-foot reptilian water deities who protect waterways. They take the form sometimes of very beautiful and seductive women who eat their lovers later, And so Haumea is the hau. Haumea is a mo'o. She is established as a mo'o, so she herself can take the form of a reptilian water deity. Her children, some are mo'o. One of her daughters is Pele, which was well known and famous, right, beyond Hawaii as the deity of the volcanoes. She's not just the deity of the volcanoes, though. She is the lava. Pele means lava. So she is the lava. So the hau to me is really amazing. The flowers are bright yellow. I think the older flowers sometimes turn orange or kind of a reddish color. But the reason why hau is so amazing is that a lot of people think of hau as an invasive species. So if there's hau nearby, it will tend to take over an area. It's an indicator of fresh water. So in one of my neighborhoods, you can actually see where the stream is because you can see the hau trees kind of lining the stream. It grows along freshwater streams. It grows along the oceans. And what's really cool is that even though people think about it as an invasive species, I've learned that it is actually what protects the ancient loʻikalo walls. So walls that are 800 to 1500 years old are right now being protected by the hau that have grown over them in these thickets. They're impenetrable thickets. And what they have protected the walls from are the cattle brought in by the ranchers who would have trampled the walls, and it would have been impossible to learn from the ancestors about where the lo'i were located because they built their lo'i specifically in relation to the elements and what would be the optimal way of planting kalo. So I've gone with one of the farmers into Punalu'u Valley where his land is, and he goes with a machete and he was cutting away at the hoe, and you can see those walls. And we had a work day where 25 of us showed up with power saws and we cut through the hoe to reveal all of the lo'i walls beneath. And Kanaloa Bishop, one of the bishops, he explained to me that hoe is easy to remove because it has a very small root ball, but the branches are what protects the house. You can remove the root ball and then replant the kalo. It doesn't destroy the land for kalo. At the fish ponds used to be surrounded by hoe. And recently, because of climate change, the El Nino Modoki is a variant of the El Nino that's moving east. And so what happens is that the fish ponds now in Hawaii are suffering from the El Nino Modoki, which intensifies the heat in the fish pond. It takes away the oxygen, it lowers the oxygen levels, and the fish die if they're in pens. And so what they learned was they repaired this particular fish pond wall so they didn't have to use the net pin. They actually had to take out the mangrove, which was choking the stream flow from He'ea Stream. Now, mangroves in other places are good flood mitigation, but in this particular case, the mangrove was choking off the water from the stream and allowing it to enter into the fish ponds. And so if you look to traditional knowledges, it wasn't mangrove that surrounded the fish ponds, it was the hoe, because the hoe can shade the water, it can provide shelter for the baby fish. As the stream flows restore and oxygenate the fish ponds, the hoe is able to keep the ponds cool, relatively cool. So that's why hoe to me is like an amazing, it is an embodiment of haumea and how it protects the lo'ikalo where we grow the kalo to eat. And it also shades the fish ponds where the mahi are recultivating mullet for people to survive. And also the other thing they teach us is that we have to stop eating ahi and aku, which are pelagic fishes. They're like deep sea fishes, and we have to retrain our palates to eat mullet. So I also
Okay,
think that's
mullet
another.
is more freshwater fish.
It's a saltwater fish, but it's like a white fish. And I did not grow up eating mullet, so it's been kind of it's a different taste, right? They have different tastes. So
Yeah, I'm sure the
yeah,
fat content. I think we all like love the ahi. It's just so
yeah, because
scrumptious,
it's
but we're just
red.
been
Yeah, red blood. Yeah,
we've
red
really just
flesh.
been, I don't know, trained. We've trained
Yeah.
ourselves, our palate to a certain way, right?
So I gotta
So
make poke out of a mullet now. You know? Yeah.
that's
So that's
great.
the story of how that I love. I love the how trees.
So I would encourage everyone to read this book. Yeah, we'll definitely put a link to it in the show
Awesome.
notes.
Thank you.
And I don't know if I do have a couple other questions real quick.
Yeah.
One, I guess, is do you have any advice or lessons learned for ecological restoration practitioners that maybe you haven't shared yet? Perhaps how we could integrate mappings and moʻolelo in our practice or anything else?
Okay, so I guess one of the things that I really wanted to get across is the fact that even though small, harmful environmental events have exponentially expanding consequences, small, local restoration events also have exponentially expanding restorative effects. That is the key to me because people think that scale has to be global in order for restoration to work. And it's like, no, you could have a small restoration project that impacts the world globally. And I think that's sort of the lesson that I learned in speaking with all of these directors of restoration projects. And in terms of the moʻolelo, they're looking to those ancestral stories of the people who've lived there for, over 1,000 years. And they're looking to those stories to find out how best to manage these crises that we're coming up against. And so I think that I think wherever people are, they're learning that the ancestral knowledges are the ones that are the most effective, the most successful. I'm thinking about the burning of the bush in Australia and how they realized that it was because they had taken management of the bush away from the Aboriginal stewards. So I feel like that's one of the things that, that ancestral knowledge, the stories they have embedded in them, encoded in them, lessons about approaching climate change.
Yeah, that's some great lessons learned. I think, anybody in their practice or even imagining a practice, that's good perspective. Thank you. Winding down our time, unfortunately. Is there a way for people to get in touch with you or find out more about the book?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. I have an Instagram account. I have a Twitter account. I have a Facebook account. So I'm on social media. I don't have a place where I'm compiling all of the podcasts. I think this means that maybe I should start a website and then list down the podcasts that I've been on so far and
You're making the
public
rounds, I
talks.
think.
Yeah,
a
new
little
books,
bit. I heard a
think
couple.
third. And then, our department at our university, we have these talks.
Mm.
So I will try to put something up, but I don't have anything. I think if you Google my name, a lot of the talks will come up. I have an academia.edu website if you want to read more about the different things that I've been doing. That's up there. And I wanted to mention that if you get the book from Duke, you can actually type in the code FJKNE for a 30% discount on the book. So just wanted to let everybody know you don't have to get it from Amazon. You can get it directly from Duke.
Yes. Yeah, please. I think support Duke. Duke University Press.
Yeah.
Doing good stuff.
Yeah, my editor,
right.
Elizabeth Alt, was awesome. And the cover, they just did a beautiful job. Liesl Hampton was my project manager, and the art was by Amy Harrison, did the artwork for the cover. So,
super.
thank you.
Well, I enjoyed this thoroughly.
I did too.
I could listen to I could listen to so many more stories. Those are excellent. Yeah, I appreciate your time so much. And
Thank you.
Congratulations on the book. All right, take care. Thanks for finding Tree Hugger Podcast again and tuning into this discussion with author Candace Fujikane. Next episode, we're going to bring you a conversation with Alex Slakey. Recently, we sat down and talked about the practice and the business of live staking, using the old new techniques of coppice and pollard. Here's a piece of that conversation.
Coppice forestry is actually one of the oldest human forms of agriculture. North America versus Asia versus Europe, there's been different ways that coppice forestry has been something that has been done, and it is basically when you cut down a hardwood tree or shrub and then it sprouts back.
I appreciate you joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about Candace Fujikane, where you can find out more about her online at treehuggerpod.com. We are on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show, or tell a friend about the show. You can now donate to the show. At the Tree Hugger website, there's a PayPal link. If you are in the position to donate some funds, it would help to offset some of the show's costs. Thanks for considering. The music for the show you heard from Chris Haugen and Reed Mathis. One can find a link to them in the show description. Thanks for hanging out.